our monthly Jewish Earth Alliance Network meeting, and I want to welcome everybody. I see a lot of new faces. I hear we sent out an invitation for the Unitarians from the WISC meeting, and welcome to you all. And we're going to start, we always start off with a spiritual uplift by a member of our clergy. And I would like to welcome Rabbi Ed Rosenthal, who's the executive director of the Suncoast of Florida Hillels, including the University of Tampa, Southern Florida, Florida Southern, and Eckerd College. And he founded Tikkun HaYam, repair of the sea, to share the spiritual wonders of the ocean from a Jewish perspective and raise awareness in the Jewish world about our deep connection to the sea and encourage action to address the many threats facing the marine environment. Rabbi Ed is also the founder of, and I just adore this, I wish I thought of this, Scooby Jew, which encourages Jews to connect with the ocean through scuba diving, snorkeling, swimming, and creating hands-on tzedek, righteous opportunities to repair the sea. So welcome to you, Rabbi Ed.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Devorah. It's really a pleasure to be here. And yeah, thank you for letting me share something.
Yes.
First of all, this past week, we commemorated Tisha B'Av, which was the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the first Holy Temple by the Babylonians, the second Holy Temple by the Romans 1,959 years ago. And it's something that we Jews have done for thousands of years, recognizing all the tragedies that have happened on this day for thousands of years. On a more personal level, and like so many Jews around the world, I commemorated Tisha B'Av and remembered the Holy Temple. But this past week, I live in Tampa Bay, I live in St. Petersburg, and I couldn't help but mourn the fact that we just experienced a red tide. And in this week, they removed just about 700 tons of dead fish from our area. Now, people say red tide is a natural occurrence. And it is. It's a natural algae which gets stirred up by hurricanes and the like. However, we have to see the fingerprint of humans on the process, that not only is it hurricanes stirring up the algae, but the fertilizer, the pollution, the chemicals that are that exacerbate the growth of the red tide bloom, which just kills the sea life. We've had a record number of manatee deaths this year because not only of the red tide, but because we're killing the seagrass on which they live. So we Jews have mourned the Holy Temple for almost 2,000 years. The Jewish Earth Alliance has the opportunity to hopefully make it so that we don't have to mourn our own earth. We talk about, my Hillel, our tagline is ensuring the Jewish future, theirs and ours. And at Tikkun HaYam, we say that if we don't protect the ocean, there's going to be no future for any of us, Jewish or otherwise. And so I'd like to take a moment, if you don't mind, as the newest partner organization of the Jewish Earth Alliance, to share a little bit with you about what Tikkun HaYam is, because we are the only Jewish environmental organization that focuses solely on the marine environment. And I can't help myself. Everything I do goes through the lens of Torah. And so a little bit that we maybe aren't aware of, water is the most abundant substance on earth. And so we have a tendency to take it for granted. We leave our faucets running when we brush our teeth. We run our dishwashers when we don't have a full load. It's the most abundant substance on earth, yet we take it for granted. But it's the most amazing of all substances. It's the only substance on the planet that exists naturally in all three stages of liquid, gas, and solid. It's also the only substance liquid that can sustain life. If you put a goldfish in a bowl of milk, it will die. If you put a goldfish in a bowl of Coca-Cola, it will die. If you put a goldfish in a bowl of water, it will live. 70% of the planet is water, and water produces 60 to 80% of all the oxygen on Earth. That's more than all of the rainforest trees and plants on the planet combined. Water, the ocean is the greatest sequesterer of carbon on the planet. It sequesters more carbon than anything else. Yet again, we take it for granted. And since it exists in all three stages, remember the troposphere, and I say all three stages, liquid, gas, and solid. The troposphere, the aerial ocean, if you will, where our climate is created, it's the lowest level of Earth's atmosphere, is 70% water. It mirrors the liquid ocean. 70% of the troposphere is water in its gaseous, in its vapor form. Water, unlike any solid substance, cannot be carbon dated. It has no beginning and it has no end. The amount of water on the planet today is the same amount of water that was present when the Earth was formed. And so all of these factors have to ask us as Jews, what does this sound like? And so if you go back, and I want to be very cognizant of my time, I only have a minute. The very first line of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, v'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei tahom, v'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God hovered on the waters. And then the next line is the famous line, Vayomer Elohim Yehior Vayior. And God said, let there be light and light. And everybody thinks that's where everything started. But Rashi, our great Torah commentator, said, when he commented on Genesis 1, verse 2, he said, it teaches us that the sequence of creation as written is impossible. If so, if you say that scripture indicates the order of creation, he says, Tamei al atzmecha, be astounded at yourself. For the water preceded everything, as it is said, as it is written, and the Spirit of God hovered on the face of the water. And scripture did not disclose when the creation of water took place. From this you learn that the water preceded the earth. And it's this understanding. I could go on for hours, but I won't because my timer just went up for 5 minutes. This is what we do. We don't look to water as a resource for humanity. We don't look to water as how do we get it from the aquifer to the field. Tikkun HaYam looks to water lishma, for its own sake. And we want to raise the awareness in our community about the necessity. If the ocean dies, we all die. And it's a Jewish responsibility to protect it. And I go so far as to say that if we want to address climate change, the first step in addressing climate change is protect the ocean. And so I thank you all for allowing me to join you this evening.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ed. I know it's difficult to ask a rabbi to speak.
I set a timer. I don't know how I did.
That's what I have to do. It's a discipline. But I want to let you know I'm wearing my fish shirt in honor.
Fantastic.
But thank you very much. That was beautiful that the water preceded the light. As much as we believe in Big Bang, the creation of electrons, but the water preceded the creation.
Well, that's the following the next hour of the Dvar Torahs to address that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, and welcome to your group for being partners with us. It's terrific.
Thank you.
All right. So first, Ed, I want to introduce Ed. Many of you know Ed Kopp. He is our techie, and he's going to assist us. We'd like to allow you to introduce yourselves to each other. So I wanted to take a few minutes to break out into small groups, like 3 each, I think, Ed. And a question for tonight to chat with each other for about 5 minutes. And I suggest that you ask each other if you have an activist, a climate or environmental activist who inspires you. who they may be living or gone, but someone who inspires you, and chat with each other about that and introduce yourselves. Give everybody your name and where you're from, and if you're affiliated with a particular group, that would be good too.
Oh, fun.
I also love CWCWC as an acronym. That's so great.
Quack, quack. They used to call it, which I could never bring myself to say that, but they used to call it quack, quack. One of the great things was they had this guy who did cartoons for them. All their newsletters had cartoons about this horrible environmental tragedy that was, actually, we should talk about it. You would understand a lot more about it in New York.
Okay, I'm very
Remind
curious.
me, we'll talk about it more. Who had fun meeting their new friends? Isn't that always the best part?
There you go.
We talked about the people who inspired us, but you all inspire me.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I was saying it's some are famous people and some are the commoners, the unnamed activists, and people who struggle, like the people in Minnesota as well, against the big corporations, etc. At any rate, okay, well, I'm glad you got to know each other a bit. And I would now like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Tonight, I'd like to welcome Beth Osborne, who began her career in the House of Representatives, working for Ron Klink from Pennsylvania and Brian Baird from Washington State. And then she moved to the Senate to work for Tom Caper from Delaware as an advisor on transportation.
China is the biggest spy on the population. That's the whole irony of it all.
Uh-oh.
Their digital wand, basically.
Mike? Oh, we have to, let's see, we have to mute Mike. Ed, you want to mute as well? So Beth moved to, where was I? Moved to the Senate and was an advisor on transportation, trade, and labor.
Devorah, you're muted.
I accidentally muted Rabbi Lynn.
Oh dear. Oh, so you haven't heard a thing I said.
We heard up until my working for Senator Carper on transit.
Oh, good. Oh, that's great. I don't know how that happened. I must have pressed something.
Devorah, you're also getting darker in there. If there's a way
Yeah.
that you can lighten up your space, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah. When I finish introducing her, I will turn on some more lights. Thank you for letting me know. I forget it gets dark. Well, it's gray today. So Beth served at the Department of Transportation as Secretary for Transportation Policy from 2009, and she is now the Director of Transportation for America, an advocacy organization of local, regional, and state leaders who envision a transportation system that safely, affordably, and conveniently connects people of all means and abilities to jobs, services, and opportunities through multiple modes of transportation. And so she's going to talk to us about how transportation is an integral part of the jobs, the American Jobs Bill that is that we are working on in our action alert. So welcome, Beth, to Jewish Earth Alliance.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
I do have a few slides I'd like to share if someone can give me those permissions. But as Rabbi Lynn said, I work at a national nonprofit. We do our work, mostly we're known for working through policy, sorry, wrong button. We do a lot of work in research and analysis of how the current system is working as well. And we also do direct technical assistance with those who want to do more to meet that mission that was laid out, connecting people to jobs and essential services by all modes of travel, no matter their financial means or physical ability. So I am going to share my PowerPoint here. What a lot of people are familiar with is kind of this graphic here that shows where carbon emissions are coming from in the transportation sphere. What is important to point out here is not just that transportation sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's growing. So while all the other sectors are getting more efficient, transportation is getting less efficient. It's the only sector going in the wrong direction. You'll notice that this is driven by personal automobiles. That's the overwhelming bulk of the emissions. In terms of the machinery operating on the roadway system or on the transportation system, but we'll talk a little bit more about what else is going on to support the transportation system. If you want to look at things, we talk a lot about electrification, and there's a lot of talk about electrification of transit. You'll notice that transit falls in that 5% group. And is a very small part of the system, important to electrify, but really looking at those cars and freight trucks, that's a big chunk of it. So what I'm going to talk about is not actually electrification. Electrification is a must. It is not negotiable. All vehicles need to not emit. This is critical. It is essential. Unfortunately, it is also insufficient. Those who have done real research into this know, particularly the excellent work done by the California Air Resources Board, finds it doesn't get us all the way. And one of the reasons it doesn't get us all the way is it's not the only emitter in the transportation system, the vehicles themselves, but also we are headed towards big increases in emissions before we fully electrify. And that's something we've seen in the past. So when I was in the Senate, my boss was at the lead in increasing CAFE standards, the vehicle emissions standards, for the first time, in decades. And when I went over to USDOT, we implemented those standards, and we saw vehicles get a lot more efficient, but we also saw emissions go up because people were driving so much more that it undercut the benefit of that efficiency. And actually, in our rulemaking, we had to account for that because we find when people spend less on gasoline, they actually drive more. And we see this, we've seen that the average person is driving 20% more now than they were in the 90s. And a lot of that is the fault of our transportation system as we've laid it out, as well as our communities. We just make it harder to share rides, to get places quickly. A lot of our trips have grown in length because the things we need are put further and further away from us. That grocery that was close to home is closed, and now there's a new bigger one much further away, things like that. And if you would consider getting out of your vehicle, you would be punished for it by incredibly dangerous conditions on our roadways. Just in terms of the other environmental impacts of a driving only system, which is what we have in our country, we do talk about the vehicle emissions. The pavement and the concrete production, which will have to go on no matter what kind of vehicle is on our transportation system, also emits not just carbon, but criteria pollutants like fine particles that are what cause a very severe heart and lung problems. And we find that it's more likely to do so in lower income and neighborhoods of color. The urban heat island effect is going to be a major impact on quality of life. Again, much more likely in areas that are populated by people of color, which are much more paved and much less green. Impervious surface runoff is a big problem of all of the pavement that will be needed for any kind of car, especially in a car-only society. We know that particulate matter is produced just from tires and brakes, and we know it's worse the heavier the vehicle, and electric vehicles are heavier than gas vehicles. The vehicle manufacturing, the loss of natural land due to sprawl, parking construction and maintenance, all of these things go on even if the tailpipe starts emitting or stops emitting. And so having a more holistic attack on decarbonizing transportation is essential. Again, got to electrify the vehicles, but pretending that that's all we have to do and we can wash our hands of this issue is inaccurate. and has impacts beyond just the environment. My big fear is we are going to attempt such a surgical strike on carbon emissions from the tailpipe that will double down on a lot of the racial inequities, the cost components, the safety hazards, and all the other problems of the transportation system. Whereas if we would attack them, we would also reduce carbon and get us to our goals. One of the big problems that I mentioned is just the layout of our communities. Back in the early 20th century, under the direction of Herbert Hoover, the Department of Commerce determined that we needed to deal with the problems of early industrialization, which there were highly polluting industries very close to people's homes. We had water quality issues, overcrowding in cities, sewage issues because we didn't have good water and sewage treatment. And they divined a system that would spread people out and put houses far away from businesses and industry far away from them. And they pushed that system out, which is now the default way that we develop. And you see the impact of that in the circle on the right. So you'll notice if you look at the yellow house here and the purple school, the distance between them is really about the same as the yellow house here and the government building over here on the left-hand side. But the path is not straight. In an old-fashioned gridded system, you can go to one area, a whole bunch of people in one car, divide up, run a bunch of errands, drive home. To do the same thing, even you can't go as the crow flies between properties. You have to go out to a major road, which if you do on foot will be like a highway and incredibly dangerous if it's accommodating at all, and drive over to the next cul-de-sac and go in. So even short distances are made longer. This is very much like our stream system where you've got, water runoff from hillsides, little streams and creeks that roll into rivers. And when it rains like crazy, that river floods. Well, we've created a transportation system that creates a flood twice a day during the time everyone's traveling. And it's designed to do so, but then we spend all of our time trying to pretend if we just build a wider and wider road, we will prevent that. It doesn't work, but it does result in extreme danger. And we're seeing historic increases in pedestrian fatalities because as we try to make longer distances that you can only travel by car more convenient by speeding up the cars, we box out everyone else that might even just want to cross the street. We make it very hard for pedestrians to move around. And we are finding that not only is this getting worse year over year, that people of color are bearing the brunt of that. You can see the difference between a white person and a Black or Native American person is quite substantial in terms of who's more likely to be killed on the roadway. And that's for two reasons. One is those highway style roads are more likely to be built in neighborhoods of color, but also it's people of color who are least likely to have access to a personal automobile for every single person over 16 years old in their home. So they're more likely to be walking around. This all kind of leads, these barriers to moving around, to taking short trips are the answer to how we solve the problem in the transportation system. We make it safe to get out of our car by designing a roadway that is meant to serve a neighborhood, to serve people, whether they're in a car or not, which means slowing down that traffic. We found last year as traffic went down, speeds went up and fatalities went through the roof. We saw one of the highest pedestrian fatality rates and overall fatality rates that we've seen in 96 years. So what we find is actually traffic congestion is one of our most important safety interventions, but it's the number one thing we're trying to get rid of. We need to make a highway level investment in transit. Right now, we peg transit investment to 20% of highway investment. That's a deal that was struck under the Ronald Reagan era, and we have stuck to it like it was commanded from above. But we've never made the sort of investment in transit that we made in highways. We need to make short trips easier. We need to make it possible to cross a major street without having to walk half a mile or a mile out of the way, which we do to not slow down the traffic on that roadway. We need to measure what matters. We need to measure whether or not people can arrive where they're going. Right now, we really just look at how fast vehicles are moving. We don't measure other travelers. The only people who matter are the people in the vehicles. And we don't measure whether or not they have a convenient trip from home to work or home to the grocery. We only measure whether or not their speeds are fluid. And if we have to make their travel distance longer to keep those distances fluid, like not allowing left-hand turns or making people go wildly out of their way to their destination, we still count that as a time benefit, because we assume if travel speeds are high, that people's trips are shorter. We don't measure the trips to disabuse ourselves of that notion. And we need to focus spending on existing communities and making them work better, rather than building at the fringe where the travel has to be by automobile and the longest way, and a very expensive proposition in terms of transportation costs to the household. I'm just going to finish up by saying a little bit about where we are legislatively. The Senate has passed a highway bill, and the House has passed a broader bill with highways, transit, and rail. The House package here was fantastic. Their investment in electrification, in transit, in supporting the operations of transit, in making it safer to walk and bike, in prioritizing investments in existing communities over expansion. Right now, we like to build the new things so much, we just let the existing stuff fall apart, which isn't just irresponsible, it really does drive carbon emissions up because it pushes development further and further out and makes trips longer. They require the measurement of greenhouse gas emissions. We don't even measure it. We don't even require people to get a sense of what we're emitting from the transportation system or how our investments could impact it. And I think what's important to know is in this bipartisan negotiations on a big infrastructure package, they're going very heavily towards the substandard status quo Senate bill that doesn't really consider our environmental impacts. And they're really boxing out the House. And so one of the most important messages we need to send is, if you really care about climate and frankly, public health and safety and equity, we're gonna move in the direction of the House bill, not the Senate bill. I can answer folks' questions about all the crazy shenanigans here, but the thing that really needs to, the crux of it is not the procedure, it's the fact that everyone thinks it's worth continuing to build a system that generates carbon to get a deal, rather than seeking a deal that does good. And it's going to be up to us in advocacy to say nothing is better than doing more damage, that we have to really consider the generational impacts of these assets that will have a life of 25 to 75 years and will have negative carbon impacts for that period of time. And that is not a message that is super loved by the Senate, particularly by Senate Democrats that like to believe that all transportation projects are wonderful, but it's one that they desperately need to hear. And at that point, I can answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those were very enlightening lists and charts about, it's not just about electrifying the cars, it's all the infrastructure surrounding it as well. Can you repeat what you just said at the end about what's important to say to the members of Congress that we're writing, that they should aspire to the House bill?
Yes. And I think in the Senate, the other problem is they're under the impression that the amount of spending is the point and not how it is spent and what is built. There's a very strange disconnect in Washington, D.C. and a lot, even in the states when it comes to transportation. The belief is the only question is how much you spend, which works if you believe all transportation projects create good. And that is kind of what they believe. I grew up in New Orleans, and one of the the biggest legacies of the earlier days of the highway program was the devastation caused to the Treme neighborhood by building an elevated expressway that continues to, during a rainstorm, which you may have heard is frequent in New Orleans, to create buckets of water draining off the sides. Try being a pedestrian going through a waterfall underneath that thing or living right next to it. It's called the monster. And we like to believe that those projects are in the past, but I can tell you my own state of Louisiana has a plan to knock down a historically Black neighborhood in Shreveport to build another interstate through there. And this windfall of money is just what they're waiting for. So it's not in the past. And the notion that just spending is what matters is truly dangerous. And I think it's our job to remind them that they have to think not just about totals, but the results. Again, these are 25 to 75-year assets that will impact generations to come. And if they're blocking the ability, the choice to get out of your vehicle or take short trips, they can hardly do anything good for public health or the environment.
Thank you. Thank you. That really expands on what you said. Let's see, Judy Burlfine, is that your hand that's raised that I see?
I don't know what it says there, but thank you. So thank you so much. Very, very interesting. My question for you, because this is such a complicated, confusing time, I agree with everything you're recommending, but if we push for these things in the infrastructure bill, do we risk losing the 60 votes that we, like, it's, you have to, like,
Yes.
where's the line to make sure, because if nothing passes, then we're all screwed. So how do you make?
I don't know that I agree with that. We have to ask ourselves, how much damage are we willing to tolerate for the much smaller benefits in this proposal? We're talking about some good money for electrification, but it's not enough. And we'll take that, and like, how many of us are willing to trade off the historically Black neighborhood in Shreveport in order to get that? And that's one. We also have one in Dallas. We have one in Tampa. There's a huge list there's one in the Pearl District, I believe, in Portland. I mean, we're going to put much more money in this program on expanded and new highways that will create equity and climate problems in the short and medium term in order to get much smaller amounts of money for beneficial things. And Congress, particularly the Senate, has us convinced that it's that or nothing, and nothing is worse. I don't know that I agree that keeping the highway spending down so that that generational damage can't be done is preferable. And it's very disturbing to me that there's not one Senate Democrat that understands that. Not one.
How are we going to change that? Elect a whole new Senate. Yeah.
Well, I think it's really just having them hear people say this. They're not used to it. They come from a world where the gas tax throws off more money than we know what to do with, and the negotiations are how to divide up the pot. That is a fun debate, and it's super bipartisan, to be passing out the money. And I just don't think they've adjusted to the new reality where the program does not pay for itself, and that we want to see a different outcome than the outcomes that we have perpetuated for the last 50 years, which is longer trips, more single occupancy trips where you're driving alone over longer distances, more and spending more and dividing communities and rising fatalities. They don't think that substantively, but they're starting to feel the pressure because people are really pushing back on them and saying, we want to see a higher percentage of money for transit. If we're ever going to meet our climate objectives, we need that. We want to see more focus on safety, not the speed of vehicles. And if we're going to see climate benefits, equitable access to education and jobs, we need that. And I think that those messages, the more they hear them, the more they break through.
Yeah. Mike Cummins, is it? You have a question?
Hi. I just moved from the Dallas area where I lived for 3 years, and I was up in Plano in the a suburb just north, and it's incredible amount of flat area in every direction.
Yep.
So that's why there's a housing boom going on. It's like, you know, rated the best place to buy your first home, and it's always going to be cheap, right? And there's a huge race to build highways to get to these suburbs as they continue to go north. Eventually, it'll be just one city between Oklahoma City and Dallas. And the people of Frisco, which is, you know, next to Plano, they voted down a light rail system to go next to the tollway, basically to keep poor people out of Frisco. So it seems that, from what I could tell, and by the way, these suburbs are very they're not like lily white suburbs. They're built on the tech boom. You don't see a lot of Latino and Black people, which you would think in Texas, but rather you see people from all around the world who've come because of the tech boom, and it's actually quite well integrated suburbs racially. But it's the unifier is the American dream of a big house, and people are willing to drive forever to get to it. And so what you're saying really rings true. I just am wondering how, you know, it seems to me the problem is one of really changing what the American dream is all about. I mean, really, we're really talking about urban planning, are we not? I mean, that seems to me what you're talking about. And boy, I don't have a question. I'm just commenting on how depressed that makes me, because I don't know how we're going to change people's attitudes on that.
Let me turn it around for you. Our attitudes, our beliefs about what housing is needed is based in the early 1970s, when families with children made up the majority of households. They now make up about 30% of households. How many 1 and 2 person households do you know looking for 4 and 5 bedroom homes? We actually have a surplus of them compared to the demand, which is why they're cheaper. But those 1 and 2 person households are in incredible demand, those smaller homes, and the supply is way low, which is why the cost of them have gone through the roof. That first home, you know, when that kid comes out of high school or college, they don't tend to look for the 4-bedroom ranch house. But because the millennials have only been given 4-bedroom ranch houses as their alternatives, they're not building up a nest egg to buy, and they're not getting in. What's interesting is I look at my own parents in New Orleans. There's an attitude, because of all the new housing, that you don't want a used house, a pre-owned house. It's like a car now. They're hard to get rid of. And if you want to downsize, you can't afford it. So it's actually we're finding that the boomers trying to get rid of their houses are struggling. So now that investment isn't as good. If we got out of the way and just supplied the market, we'd have a totally different housing supply. And that's been proved by the National Association of Realtors over and over. We just don't make it legal to build that way. And when your only open options are the homes on the fringe, you're not choosing it. It's that or renting or not having a place to live. And we call that choice in this country. So
you're saying it's really just zoning?
Yes.
Wow.
Our zoning is anti-market. Our zoning is like the diamond trade. We could have something that could be ubiquitous, but we restrict the supply and only the wealthy can afford it. That's what's going on. The market is so distorted by zoning. It's extraordinary. But there's
what are the forces behind that zoning?
The forces
the realtors, or, you know, why won't the city council go with where the market wants to go?
It's something that people don't understand. It takes a big fight to make any change, any place, anytime. Now try to make it in something that's highly technical that people don't get. And it's too much for them to take on in a lot of cases. Also, like I said, it was created by the federal government in I believe the first enabling statutes were put out in 1924. But it was 100 years ago this year that they put together the commission to come up with those enabling statutes. And now the attitude is 84,000 individual local governments have to figure it out independently. That's not very efficient either. Some have, a bunch have, My colleagues at the Form-Based Codes Institute have worked with a whole bunch of communities, but it's an incredibly inefficient and unfair way to do it, is to ask every community of every size to figure this out alone, which is what we've done. I also think it's important to give local governments some tools. So in Plano, no one's pointed out to them that the life of their community is short. They got 20 years before no one will pay to repair their potholes because there aren't enough people there generating taxes to afford to replace their road. My friends at Strong Towns and my friends on the economic side of my own organization will run the numbers and show that the cost to maintain your road is not paid off by the taxes you're bringing in because everything's so spread out, which is why you see that first ring suburbs, unless there's extreme concentrated wealth, falling apart. And the second round of suburbs are falling apart faster because they were thrown up faster and they have even less densities. So if we pointed out to them that in the next 10 to 20 years, your taxes would have to go up by 100 to 200% to replace your roadway, or no one will ever replace it again, I don't know how much demand there would be for that thing. But right now we're just lying to everyone. And those local governments count those roads only as assets and not as liabilities. They don't count on the cost of maintenance. So there's a lot that we can do just by giving people basic information about what they're buying into and what the future of that setup is. But we find that there's an incredible market for walkability and transit. That's why if you live close to transit or in a walkable neighborhood, your community is unaffordable. And we say that it's so unaffordable, no one wants to live there. That does not make, that might have made sense to Yogi Berra, but it doesn't make sense to anybody else. And so if we have an overwhelming demand so that any neighborhood that is walkable is unaffordable, we need to build many, 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 many more of them. And right now it's against our transportation and zoning rules.
Wow. All right. Well, God, I've got a lot of questions in the chat. Let me start through those. Don Parsons asks, we have seen how impoverished society Cuba can keep internal combustion vehicles running for 50 years. Electric vehicles and electrification are attractive to the affluent, but what about the lower socioeconomic groups without the means to purchase new and expensive vehicles? Will they adopt the model of Cuba and continue to drive the old vehicles?
I think that this is a really important question. And we know that vehicle turnover is slow, especially because we make vehicles much better now than we used to. I think that we tend to average it out at about 12 years for the turnover of the fleet, but it's slowing down. And there's a lot we can do to make electric vehicles more affordable and make recharging them easier that a lot of my colleagues from environmental organizations have developed. And I'm seeing a lot of really positive provisions on those fronts in the various pieces of legislation, because it's just been very attractive to government to tell the auto industry to get their act together. It's just government doesn't like to look in the mirror and see how they don't want to be told to get their act together within government. They want the auto industry to handle it for them. So I think that there's a lot that we can do there. But more importantly, poor people shouldn't have to own lots of vehicles. That's extraordinarily expensive. Transportation is often the second or first highest expense to particularly poor people. And that's because they are often pushed further out with higher transportation costs to be able to get to basic necessities. And in my own experience growing up in a first ring suburb in New Orleans, we had to own 4 cars for 5 people. That's about $8,000 a year per car. If my parents didn't have to pay that, I wouldn't have had to take out so many loans that it took until I was 48 years old to pay off. And I only paid it off because I did it on a massively accelerated level, which is not available to most people. Most people in my circumstance would have been paying off college until their own kids were in college. And that was, created by a system where everyone has to get around by vehicle. So, electric, internal combustion engine, whatever, it's very expensive. And that's why I say it's more equitable to allow people to just be able to go short distances, like my brother, who's 3 blocks from a grocery store, but couldn't walk there unless he wanted to die on the roadway because there's no place to walk except in a drainage ditch or in traffic.
Wow. God, I've got quite a few questions. Let's see. Are there governors or big city mayors who get it? I'm going to give you a couple questions at a time. Let's see. Are some willing to speak up in favor of better, not just more? Does Secretary of Transportation Pete get it?
Sure.
And what are your thoughts about hydrogen-powered vehicles in California? Is it a feasible option for the rest of the country?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I will say different governors get different pieces of this. I actually been very impressed, particularly on the layout of communities, how well the governor of North Dakota gets it. He's got an incredible Main Streets initiative, and he's often pointed out that the sprawling layout of Fargo means that fewer people have to cover more cost in terms of, just the operations and maintenance of their roads, plowing them, things like that. And it creates a huge cost burden on the community. And so he's been focusing on investing where there's already development and intensifying development there for cost reasons, but it has huge carbon impacts and quality of life impacts too. In California, they have done some incredible things in measuring what counts in transportation and really getting their arms around what the climate impacts of various investments are. And that's been really exciting to see. The state of Colorado is now looking at creating a set of mitigations and better measurements for climate impacts of various transportation projects. So, you see pieces of it in different places. The state of Massachusetts did some really cool things on making roads safer. But I have to say, statewide elected Democrats are just very unimpressive on transportation. I really struggle to think of anybody that doesn't think that the goal is to build out a highway system like it's still 1956. And so they're very frustrating and they need a lot of education. On the Republican side, there can be problems, but they worry about spending. So there's a way in with the Republicans just on limiting government spending that you don't have with the Democrats. In terms of Secretary Pete, I worked with him a lot when he was mayor. We did a lot of technical assistance on making roadways safer and slowing down speeds. I do think he gets it, but he's going up against a president who spent his career as a statewide elected Democrat, which, as I said before, is not an impressive crowd. So the pressure needs to be on the White House to allow Secretary Pete the room to push for bigger change. And I am in touch with them. When I worked in the Obama administration, I worked with very closely with the now undersecretary and a deputy secretary. It's a person from my organization that went over to take my old job from the last administration. So yeah, it's a small community. I'm in touch, and they're giving me a heads up about when the pressure needs to be and where it needs to go. And that could be very helpful. In terms of hydrogen, I think hydrogen is going to be really important, particularly for large vehicles, for big heavy duty trucks, for planes, for things that at least to date we don't quite know how to electrify very well. I think it will play a pretty important role in that area. But how we do that, I don't quite know. And I have to admit, hydrogen is not really my specialty. So I know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be helpful.
One last question. Mirala was asking, what's the most important measures in the infrastructure package for us to advocate for? And where was it? Virginia Leibowitz says, can Beth write a sample letter for each of us to send to our senators?
I can. We're working on an action alert right now, and I can send to you the letter that we sent up to Capitol Hill a few weeks ago that talked very much about the changes we need to see in the bill if we're going to care about climate, public health, the environment, and equity. So I'm very happy to share that.
Great.
Yeah.
because this is so complex, because it's very complex, and there's so much meat in what you've told us tonight. So,
well, to make it simple, we need to make it not life-threatening to get out of your car.
right.
We need to give people alternatives like transit to use. It needs to exist to choose it, and it needs to exist in quality. And we want to shorten trips by putting things that people need closer to where they live. And we could go a long way, like the House did, in just requiring departments of transportation to measure how many jobs and groceries and schools and banks can people get to by all modes of travel. Something that we've known how to do for some time now, thanks to the invention of GIS, but we still use 1950s measures in transportation. And while we're talking about turning over the vehicle fleet, I would suggest we could also update the technology of our measurements.
Great. All right. Well, gosh, there's a tremendous amount of information you gave us this evening. Thank you so much, Beth. It's really a pleasure to meet you and hear about your work. And we hope that we can advance it.
Well, I put my email in the chat. Please do feel free to reach out. And I'll also add our web address so you can see our various resources.
Oh, terrific. Oh, that's fantastic.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. And I want to thank my son, Eli, for introducing us. So
Eli is amazing, by the way. I'm sure you know this already.
Thanks. Thank you very much. All right. Well, great. Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. I want to give Muriel a couple of minutes to go over the action alert and tell us why we're still on the same one, and how important that is, that we keep up the pressure on this particular infrastructure bill.